was, to quote Bryan Adams, it was the summer of '69, and I had just been elected president of the Student Association at the University of Ottawa in March. And we had a very exciting campaign, highest turnout in the history of the university, 3 candidates. It was a fabulous campaign. Anyway, that was the peak of excitement, and then after that, people wrote exams and left the campus. The place was empty, and I was bored out of my tree. It was May. What are you going to do? Nothing to do. There was a student union building on Laurier, just opposite where the fire station is now. So we were sitting in there, and someone said, John Lennon and Yoko Ono are in Montreal doing a bed-in for peace. And so I thought, well, you know, why don't they come here? And then how are we going to get them here? And Pierre Trudeau had just been elected prime minister the year before. He was still sort of, hot, controversial, interesting, avant-garde. So, there he is now. So I said, let's link this somehow with Pierre Trudeau. We're a university. Let's organize a conference on world peace, which is what John was in bed for, right? So a conference on world peace in Canada's capital with Canada's new sexy Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, at a university. Doesn't that sound irresistible? So I got on the phone and I started calling the Queen Elizabeth where they were staying. And you can imagine the chaos down there. Everybody wants to talk to John Lennon. So it took me hours. And finally, I got through, I'm sure by mistake, to a man named Derek Taylor, who was the road manager for the Beatles. And if you read the history of the Beatles, as I have since done, you'll see that Derek Taylor was really quite an influential character in the great firmament that surrounded the Fab Four. Anyway, somehow that captured the imagination of Derek Taylor, and he said, well, why don't you come down here and we'll talk about it? I said, oh, God, I got my foot in the door. I'm home free. So I got in my car, drove to Montreal with a friend of mine, and we got up into the famous suite in the Queen Elizabeth. And when you walked into this suite, it was complete mayhem. Over in the corner, there was a group of Hare Krishna devotees chanting. In another corner, a vast suite. In another corner, there was somebody broadcasting live on a Montreal radio station. Somewhere else, there was Al Capp, you may not remember who that is, and Tommy Smothers were arguing about some political issue. And noise, and people coming and going, and things flying up in the air, and they were getting ready to record Give Peace a Chance. They were bringing in instruments. It was madness. Anyway, Derek Taylor ushers me over to the bedside, and I sit down, and he says, okay, well, tell John and Yoko what you got in mind, and which I did. And he said, oh, that's interesting. So we get to meet Mr. Trudeau. I said, well, you know, we're certainly doing everything we can to make that happen, John. Okay, good. And then I told him, he wanted to know, logistics, where do I go, and what is this, and that. Anyway, we satisfied him, and we picked a date a few days hence. And that was it. So we left his presence, went down to Derek Taylor's suite, and couldn't believe what had just happened. What do we do now? What do we do now? I mean, now I'm in real trouble. I just persuaded a Beatle to come to Ottawa, and I got to. So I said to Derek, I got to get back to Ottawa. We got work to do. So we went home, and we desperately tried to get Mr. Trudeau to come, but his foreign policy advisor, a man named Ivan Head, wrote me a letter, which I still have, saying no thank you. He's busy, and he hasn't got time for that frivolity or words to that effect. Anyway, the day came. John Lennon arrived. He came by train, and we picked him up at the train station, brought him to the campus. We had a wonderful, it turned out to be sort of a news conference, not a peace conference. But a lot of great interaction with media and with students who were there and professors. Again, chaos, but a lot of fun. At the end of that, I told him that as a concession to reality, we had to put him in front of the public at some time because the public just wanted to see him and express their affection. He said, a concession to reality. Well, that's interesting. Okay, well, let's have a concession to reality, Allan. I half expected that to turn up in a Beatles song. I was going to demand royalties. So we went through a little tunnel that connects the Arts Building with the Tabaret Hall, and we went up to those, where the pillars are. There was a huge throng on the lawn. We waved to them. Then we came back, and he wanted to have dinner, so we brought in some brown rice and fish that they asked for. And then after dinner, he wanted to go back to Montreal, but first he wanted to see something of the city. Can I look around the city? I said, well, sure, why don't you? I'll give you a drive. I have plans for tonight, but you know what? I'll see if I can put them off. And I'll drive you around the city. So my friend and I, John and Yoko in the back seat of my Volkswagen, my friend and I in the front, we're driving around. I take him to the Supreme Court. What do I know? He wants to see what, So I take him to Parliament Hill. I take him to the Champlain Lookout. As we're driving along, a Beatles song comes on the radio. And I hear from the back, turn it up. So I turned it up, and then I end up singing along with John Lennon to a Beatles song on the radio. Can you believe that? I mean, for a 20-year-old kid, that is really something special. So, and then I said, why don't we go to the Prime Minister's house just to make sure they're telling the truth when they say he's not in town? Because what politicians are like, John. I said, oh, I know. So we go out to 24 Sussex, and in those days, there was no security. You just drive right in that, that circular driveway. So we drove in and got out of the car, went to the front door, and someone came to the door, obviously an employee of some kind. No, Mr. Trudeau's not in, but I got a picture of John Lennon writing a note up against the door at 24 Sussex, which he left for Mr. Trudeau. And sure enough, 6 months later, he came back and met with him on Parliament Hill in his office. Yeah. So I took entire credit for that. So we finished the tour of Ottawa and then brought him to the railway station, and he was off to Montreal. But it was the most magical experience, the most wonderful memory. And I was so deeply impressed by him because here he was, one of the great stars of the world. I mean, most of you weren't alive in 1969, but I can tell you that in the 60s, there was no one bigger than the Beatles. They were remarkable. And among them, it was John and Paul, really, and John was enormous as a star. To think that guy would listen to a kid he doesn't know from a place he's never been, spin this yarn about, oh, come on down, that he'd say yes, that he'd come down there, that he'd spend the day with me, that he'd go out and drive around the streets with me. It was amazing. I mean, he was a trusting, genuine person. And there were no airs about him, none of this rock and roll star stuff. He was real. You were dealing with an authentic individual. And it was amazing. Great memory. Anyway, I didn't want to leave without telling you that story. And, it's going to be 50 years next June that we had him on the campus. And I've always thought we should have put up a little plaque or something to memorialize the event. The last thing I'll tell you about this is, he wanted me to join the Beatles. Right? At the end of the evening, he said, "Hey, Allan, have you got plans?" I said, "Yes, John. I want to grow up to be the president of the University of Ottawa." And he said, "Oh, okay," because I was going to suggest something else, but never mind. You're looked after. You're going to be fine. That's the way we left it. It was a lovely story, and thanks for allowing me to remember it.